Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our new CT Roundtable Mini-Podcast. My name is Taylor, and I do communications for the Roundtable, and I'm here with Stephanie, who has been interning with us this summer. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Stephanie. I've been helping Taylor with communications over the summer.
Great. And so our guest for this episode will be John Humphries, who has been the Executive Director and lead organizer of the Roundtable for about 8 years now. We wanted to take this opportunity to get some insight into John's perspectives and hear more about his experience as he concludes his time as the Executive Director and lead organizer. So I know that you've been doing organizing work for many years with many different organizations, but I'm wondering if there were any common threads or themes that you've carried across various organizations and initiatives that you've worked for.
So yes, I think much of organizing has to do with building coalitions and bringing together voices from different groups and communities. And that has been my primary experience, whether it has been in rural areas of West Virginia or working with student groups on campus or working with religious communities and bringing people together across faith lines to work on a common goal. That what I have found to be powerful in organizing is combining unusual voices together, calling for the same thing. And that has a tendency to get attention, both from media and the public, but also from decision makers, that if you have unexpected voices speaking together and standing together or marching together, then it's something that people take notice. That's the other thing that comes to mind is there's an old adage among organizers of no permanent allies, no permanent enemies. And that just recognizes that just because you strongly disagree with somebody today doesn't mean that in next year's initiative or next year's campaign, you're not going to be on the same side. And that's one more reason for recognizing and respecting the dignity and humanity even in people that you oppose today, because you may be able to work with them in the future.
So for this next question, I've heard you speak many times about the lack of hope you feel towards the climate crisis, and that building relationships and alliances is the greatest way we can prepare for the impending struggles. So I'm wondering why you think that building alliances among diverse constituencies, as our mission statement says, is the best way to address climate change.
Well, as you have heard me say in that context, there are a lot of things about climate change that we don't know. We don't know whether we've yet crossed a tipping point that means that climate catastrophe is inevitable. But what we do know with absolute certainty is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that we have put enough carbon into the atmosphere in recent decades that even if we stop immediately putting any more carbon in the atmosphere, the carbon that's already there is going to have a significant impact over the coming 2 or 3 decades. Mm-hmm. And so as we acknowledge that all the climate challenges we're already facing are going to get more serious and have a disproportionate impact on the communities with the least resources to adapt and prepare for that, then we understand that if we're going to get through this, if we're going to make it, if we're going to survive as a species, we have to be able to work together. And so in some ways, my greatest fear is that we aren't able to find our common humanity and our common ground, and that as things get harder and the scarcity and the intensity of the disasters come, that we will, rather than turning toward each other and supporting each other and standing strong together and rebuilding together, that we'll be more likely to turn against each other and leave some people behind and or actively fight against each other. And so I think that the most hopeful vision of the future that we have is by building alliances across lines of diversity and finding ways to work together and tap into our common humanity.
Mm-hmm. So since you're concluding your time as Executive Director of the Roundtable, looking back, could you describe a particularly rewarding experience where you directly witnessed the impacts of your work?
Sure. One of the things that comes to mind is that one of our early campaigns and really our first significant win as an organization was securing the establishment of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. And that happened in early 2015. And the initial step in that actually came about much faster than we imagined. When we launched into that campaign in the fall of 2014, we imagined that it would perhaps be a 2-year effort to get the state to reinvigorate its climate planning process and establish something like a Governor's Council on Climate Change. And instead, that emerged quite quickly in April of 2015 on Earth Day. Governor Malloy announced the creation of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. The hard part followed because then it was almost 3 years before the Governor's Council made a decision. And that was a long, slow slog at many times, and it took persistence and patience. And along the way, we did a lot of external organizing and engaging community and giving visibility to the work. But a lot of it was behind the scenes also, and working in the committee rooms and on the phone with my fellow GC3 members. And at the moment in January of 2018, when the Governor's Council on Climate Change finally pushed through to agreeing on recommending a much more aggressive target or goal for emissions reduction in the year 2030. And it was more aggressive than the administration had wanted, more aggressive than many members on the council wanted. But essentially, we did good, persistent organizing, and we managed to get what became a unanimous vote because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history, basically. And that would not have happened if the roundtable hadn't done what we had done and if we hadn't maintained that persistent effort. And then what rolled out from that is that because the Governor's Council made a more aggressive recommendation for emissions reduction, then the state had to also ramp up its recommendation for renewable energy. And that was an effort that the environmental community had been pushing for a long time. Then things just sort of cascaded and fell into place. And in the spring of that year, the legislature enacted both of those targets for 2030.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's so encouraging to hear.
Mm-hmm. Because it always seems like things like don't move forward in government, but that's like a really powerful moment, especially as a state. So,
and recognizing that at different times they move faster than you could imagine, and then other times it takes forever to make progress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the speed of it, I think, is particularly impressive.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I was really curious about is I know that the state's commitment to build some offshore wind farms, I think in New London, right, and Bridgeport, has been one of the Roundtable's most exciting, like really recent successes. So I wanted to know, what was the most challenging aspect of working on that legislative campaign?
Yeah, in some ways there were sort of 2 phases to the offshore wind campaign. The first phase was just getting people to understand and believe that offshore wind was something that made sense and was possible for Connecticut. So that when we first started working on offshore wind, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection had just released its comprehensive energy strategy that basically downplayed offshore wind as having any viability and playing any role in Connecticut's future. And so that first phase was just pushing back against that narrative and getting people to understand that this really was an exciting opportunity and that we could force the state to walk back and sort of shift its position and take this on. So that was, I think, clearly a challenge, was for people, who are we as a small nonprofit to step in and challenge the experts within the state government in terms of the clean energy vision for the state. The other thing I would say is that then the next phase was, once the state was on board, was pushing for a bolder vision and to say these initial small steps are good, but if we want to really capitalize on the opportunity and have Connecticut really, experience the broad benefits of this new technology, this new industry, then Connecticut needs to take bolder steps. And so in 2019, we stepped forward and said, we want to stick with the narrative and push 2,000 megawatts by 2030. And we were able to put that messaging out there and hold the line, so to speak. But it was challenging because there were even some of our allies that felt like we were trying to ask for too much and that we should be willing to accept something less just to move this forward. Mm-hmm. But in the end, we were able to, explain, express, and hold on to that vision and have enough people, and particularly legislators on both sides of the aisle, grabbed hold of that and moved it forward.
It seems like part of it is knowing that, kind of being familiar with navigating that fine line of knowing when to compromise and when not to do in certain situations, being an organizer, because I know
Absolutely.
That seems like a reoccurring theme that I hear across different movements.
Yes, and you've pointed out in other situations, there was one key op-ed that we published, and it was a major decision. Do we publish this op-ed where we intentionally and explicitly call out the governor's administration for being too timid? And that was where some of our allies strongly disagreed with us because they were afraid that we were antagonizing the administration that was inclined to support us. But yes, it was almost going with a gut feeling that this is something we can win and we need to push on this.
Yeah. So for the next question, this is kind of the classic challenger that we receive in doing this work, but how do you respond to those who are concerned that investing in renewable energy sources and taking other measures to combat climate change will lead to large numbers of lost jobs, particularly in the fossil fuel industry?
So I think there's, in some ways, at least two parts to this question. One, even if we do nothing, the market is shifting and the fossil fuel industry is declining. And so that has nothing to do with climate activism. There are internal things to the fossil fuel market that have already pushed coal to the margins, and we think will have an impact on natural gas as well. Because at this point, land-based wind is cheaper than any other source of energy. So the state with the most renewable energy is Texas because of all of the wind farms. And it's not because it's a green state, but it's because that's what makes economic sense. So that's one. And then similarly in Europe at this point, offshore wind is able to outcompete all other sources of electricity without any subsidy. So that's one thing, is that they're disconnected in some sense, that the fossil fuel jobs are going away, and it's not because of climate action. And so transition is coming, change is coming, and the question is, do we want to help control the direction of change? Do we want to help control what the new economy looks like and what kind of jobs are created and who gets those jobs? Or do we want to be passive observers and take what the market gives us? And the history of the labor movement is that when workers have been passive and waited to see what the market gives them, it's not very much. But when workers come together and say, we want to have some control and help to shape the future, then they can build collective power to have a better economy and a better economic situation for workers. And so then the other piece of it is that climate change is the real job killer. The climate change itself, not the activities that we have to take to mitigate or adapt to climate change, but the impacts that rising sea levels or drought and heat waves, and also the climate disasters in terms of heavy storms. Those are the things that are going to be the most significant job killers as we go forward. If you think about Hurricane Sandy and the devastation that had on the economy, that's what we can anticipate moving forward. And so we need to get organized to shape what the new emerging clean energy economy would look like.
Right.
So you mentioned that climate change is what's really killing the jobs, but why do you think people tend to assume that advocacy for renewable energy is somehow detrimental to jobs?
Partly because, historically, when climate movement got it started 30 years ago, it was less clear that the fossil fuel industry's longevity was limited. And there is reality that there will be and have been shifts in the economy. And so, yes, some workers are going to be displaced, and many workers have been displaced. So there is a reality there that is then exploited by politicians and players that benefit from division. And so that the fossil fuel industry and the politicians that it supports then play up those divisions and try to drive political and social wedge. And so I think that the other aspect of it is that the environmental movement has not always been good about recognizing some of the things we were talking about earlier in terms of building alliances. And there have been periods where, and continue to be particular fights where environmental movement says, well, we don't need the workers, we don't need labor, this is just too important, we've got to push forward and overcome labor's resistance, rather than searching for common ground. And how do we recognize that we need to work to provide a solid and sustainable future for the workers in the fossil fuel industry, that we're going to need them in the new economy as well.
Really quick, one of the more impressive things when I was researching the roundtable before I started working was the holistic approach that the organization took while still being focused. That to me was very mind-blowing, because I feel like studying the environment, there was really never any talk about building alliances or conversations about labor unions, or even whose jobs were going to be lost and displaced in this fight for the movement. Nobody was ever really talking about that. So having a holistic approach but while still being focused so that you're not trying to do a million things, I think is one of the more unique factors of the roundtable.
I would say it's holistic as well as realistic and strategic, in the sense that the history of the climate change battle here in the US, even more so than globally, but particularly marked here in the US, is that organized labor has been a very powerful opponent of climate change initiatives, and largely because of the narrative that Stephanie, you asked about a few minutes ago. And we could continue to bump up against them as a powerful opponent, or we can seek ways to turn them into a powerful ally. And the experience of the roundtable has been that when we have organized labor as an ally, we can get more accomplished than the environmental movement was able to do on its own.
Yeah, definitely. So I know we just talked kind of really broadly about the US climate change movement. So I wanted to kind of bring it back a little bit locally to Connecticut. What do you think are some unique either opportunities or advantages that Connecticut has as a state specifically when it comes to reducing carbon emissions and moving towards a more sustainable future?
Well, one of the things that we learned as we were doing the initial organizing around the Governor's Council on Climate Change is that Connecticut has a long history of bipartisan action and commitment to climate policy. And the Connecticut legislature passed the first state-level legislation mandating greenhouse gas emissions reduction related to climate change. That was in 1990. And so that was the first state-level legislation. And then fast forward a decade later, in 2002, it was a Republican governor that launched the first major climate initiative here in Connecticut. So Governor Rowland established the first governor's steering committee on climate change, and also shepherded in the first state's official goals on climate emissions. And so that has carried through. And if you look at the legislation that we've been able to pass here in Connecticut around the more recent GC3 targets, as well as the offshore wind legislation, both of those major legislative packages were approved with large bipartisan majorities. So that's one of the things that Connecticut brings to this fight that is not true in many other states, and certainly not true on the national level.
I was going to say, bipartisanship is certainly unique.
And it's not to say that Connecticut doesn't have partisanship in the polarized political landscape more so than it might have had a decade ago. But it is a history we can draw upon. The other things I would just lift up is that, with offshore wind, part of what makes Connecticut a valuable place is the ports that we have. We have ports that are very valuable as assets to that industry, and therefore assets to our communities that we can draw upon as that industry emerges. And then the other thing that comes to mind is just our compact scale and the fact that we can organize statewide easier than in larger states. And also just in terms of, if we look at transportation corridors and so forth, it is possible to envision sustainable systems in a state our size.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought of Connecticut's size as being an advantage, but it makes sense when you put it that way. So kind of on the other hand, I also wanted to know, what are some unique or specific challenges that Connecticut as a state has in this climate fight?
Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind, which affects most everything else in Connecticut, is the economic and racial disparities. Just that, Connecticut is one of the richest states in the union in terms of per capita income and resources, but at the same time has, among the poorest cities in the country. And as we know here in Connecticut, that economic disparity is mapped and overlaid with racial disparity, and that our racial divide is geographically commingled or overlaid with the economic and urban versus rural here in Connecticut. And so that affects everything else. That if we're going to achieve the climate goals that we've set for ourselves, we're going to need to invest a lot of resources. And at this point, the state is in financial challenges even before the pandemic. And part of what has happened is we have not implemented a fair taxation system. And that we have wealthy parts of the state that need to be paying more of their fair share so that we can achieve the common good.
So fast forwarding to the present time now and speaking to the current health pandemic, curious if you can speak a little bit to how COVID has affected the way that the public or the Connecticut community views climate change.
In the current situation where we're all working from home and in many ways feeling more isolated than before, I don't think I can really speak to what the public's views are. What I would hope might be part of what has happened is that people have a window into how challenging life can be in a crisis. And that because this has affected everybody and it's not an isolated storm event in one community, then more people have a greater sense of, oh my goodness, this could be very challenging and terrible. And at the same time, we see the value of the community working together and coming together to support each other. And so recognizing that what we were saying earlier in this conversation, that the climate crisis is going to get worse before it has any chance of getting better. Hopefully this is a window into that future, and we can recognize that we've got to work together and we have to be persistent and aggressive in addressing climate change, just as what success we have had in containing the pandemic has been about coordinated effort.
Mm-hmm. I think even just in a past conversation me and Stephanie were having about transit equity, she was just saying, and I agree, how more people are willing to help others right now and give a little bit more, almost like, we feel this way around the holidays, but it's just kind of persisted across months at this point. And I think too, like the indefiniteness of the pandemic is similar to what would happen if climate change were to become irreversible. All right, so I think that wraps up our first mini podcast with John Humphries.
Thank you, Taylor and Stephanie. This was a lot of fun. More fun than I imagined it would be.
Thank you.